All right. Thanks, Drew, for jumping on the show today. I think it'd be interesting for the viewers if you give a quick overview of who you are and what you do.
Sure. So the way I tend to describe myself is I'm an engineer who's fallen to the dark side. I'm a computer systems engineer by original training, specializing in safety of like software intensive critical systems. But very early on in my career, I began to be skeptical about the organizational processes that surround safety practices, which has led me down a path towards trying to understand safety much more from an organizational, sociological, institutional perspective. That's really what I do is I try to understand why organizations do what they do in the name of safety.
Okay. Now, you use the word safety. So it just so happens that the first question is, what is safety?
Well, I like to go with the traditionalists. So William Lauren, a thing is safe if the risk of harm is acceptable. But I'll modify that just slightly to say risk is itself very much a constructed concept. So really safety is about people accepting the uncertainty of harm.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's your full response.
That's my full answer. If you want any single word in that unpacked, we're going for hours and hours. And that's really what you need to understand about safety is every one of those words I used in the simple definition are not simple or undisputed concepts. Safety is not an easy thing, even just to name.
What are your thoughts on this definition that safety is the presence of controls or capacity?
The trouble with that definition is usually it just ends up as a reciprocal of the original definition. The more you try to pin down a new way of defining safety, you realize that you're just talking about either you can count to 10 by 1 to 10, or you can count backwards, subtracting from 10. But you're still adding and subtracting numbers. Whether you call it addition or subtraction just depends on the direction you look at it. There are some philosophical differences that come along with that, but I don't think that they're fundamental differences in definition the way Holdagel claims.
Critics have argued that these new view, adaptive philosophy approaches lack solid empirical evidence. And I was wondering, do you agree? And if so, does that challenge the credibility of these approaches?
It's a confused question. It's not even wrong as a question because it's basically type confusion, right? You have empirical evidence of a practice leading to a particular endpoint. The new view approaches are not practices. They're approaches, they're philosophies. Like they're not the types of things which you have empirical evidence. It's the same as if saying does believing in God make you safer? It's a confused question, right? Beliefs, of course, don't make you safer. What matters is your actions and the effects of those actions. It's also really kind of very, it's a cynical question because it implies that existing safety practices have empirical evidence. And, it's kind of shifting the goalposts. So we don't care about empirical evidence until you want to make us change. And then suddenly we demand evidence to change. Right? That shows that people don't really care about the evidence in the first place.
And I'll only add to that because I want this to be about you. The risk matrix is a good example of things that people do and don't necessarily demand evidence that it actually does what we want it to do. But I found almost nothing that supports the use of risk matrices.
Oh, risk matrices are fun in the same way that many safety practices are, because when you say supports the use, what are they for in the first place? Right? It's really hard to pin someone down to a concrete claim of what do they think it's doing. And the moment you pin them down to a particular claim and start questioning the evidence of that, the ground shifts. People start with, they help us make better decisions. And then you show that people don't even use them to make decisions. Oh, we don't actually use them for that. They're just one item amongst me. Okay, so which are they? How you make decisions? Are they one item? Are they a support? You've got to be specific about what you think something's doing in order to talk about the evidence as to whether it actually does that thing. And that's the trouble with a lot of safety practices is we don't even have well-defined what they're supposed to do.
And this isn't one of my questions, but from memory, that's one of those questions you unpacked in your Take 5 paper around what do we actually need the Take 5s for?
Yes, and that's another great example is we found at least 6 different things that people claim that they do. And we also found that people are very slippery, that they'll say one thing, you challenge that one thing, and immediately they shift to, it's for a different purpose, which suggests that none of the purposes are actually the reason it exists. When people don't particularly care or stick to a particular purpose for something, it suggests it exists more as a reassurance, as a psychological safety blanket, some form of ritual, rather than something that has a functional purpose in the first place.
Next question is on clutter. Is clutter inevitable, and why does it accumulate?
Inevitable is one of those words that is hard to really address. What I will say is clutter happens everywhere. It happens particularly in safety everywhere. And when something is universal like that, yes, you do begin to suspect that it's inevitable, or at least there aren't particular conditions under which it thrives or doesn't thrive. Just organizations existing or humans existing causes safety clutter to accumulate. Why does it accumulate? Mostly because it's easier to add things than to get rid of things. And the reasons why it's easier to add things than to get rid of things, that's the very, very long answer to that question.
So I think on a similar theme then, particularly on safety work as you've written about with Dave Proven, do you think in most instances this is a real problem? Like, is it a problem to actually believe that and have all this low value work there?
Yes, because often demonstrably those things are actually increasing risk. A simple example of that is most people would agree that supervision is good for safety. So every safety activity that takes a supervisor away from supervising to do safety work is making work less safe. So it is actually risky to do this apparently harmless paperwork, because you're taking away from something that would otherwise be adding to safety.
And on safety work again, I'm pretty sure this was sort of your wording, but I'm not quite sure but what would it mean to reverse the burden of proof? So require evidence for adding safety work rather than just removing it.
One of the good examples of that is we tend to add safety work during investigations. So it would require splitting out the goals of our recommendations from the recommendations themselves. For example, our goal is to increase awareness. Okay, you've now got an obligation that your recommendation to have training does actually work to increase awareness, or your goal is to improve compliance. So you've got to actually demonstrate that your recommendations would achieve that and go back and check. I think probably the first step in evidence-based safety is not requiring evidence in the first hand, because we don't have a lot of that evidence.
Right.
It's creating an obligation when you add a new safety activity that you will go back in 6 months and check whether it did what it was supposed to do.
Okay. And that seems like quite a practical, reasonable thing to do.
If we want the safety things there to be effective in the first place. And the fact that people don't do it is what leads me to my lifelong suspicion that we don't put safety work in place to be effective. We put it in place for other purposes.
Now I want to move on to risk assessments. We very quickly spoke about risk matrices, not the same thing, but risk assessments. They capture a lot of time, a lot of attention. They seem to be almost the go-to for things like, well, we'll do a risk assessment on that. And obviously you read a lot of major disasters and they do come up pretty often around we risk assessed it. So my question is, do we have good evidence that risk assessments improve maybe the quality of the decisions or actually drive a risk reduction?
To the contrary, we have almost slam dunk evidence that risk assessments usually happen after the decisions that they're intended to influence. And unless you have a time machine, that means that risk assessments cannot directly drive risk reduction. The only possibility left there, which is a tiny sliver, is that the knowledge of a future risk assessment might cause someone to make a better decision. But that's a very difficult claim to make, because it means the decision's not being informed by the actual content of the risk assessment, just by the future existence of the risk assessment. So you're talking about like real Doctor Who stuff for risk assessments to actually work. Actually, Doctor Who time travel doesn't actually tend to, Marty McFly, Back to the Future style stuff for risk assessments to be effective.
So the follow-up question is, why do you think we often do it then?
We do it to increase our subjective confidence in our decisions. We do it because we feel bad about making decisions that put people at risk. And one way to feel less bad is to turn it into a mechanistic process involving a risk assessment. Like we've got direct trails from major government decisions like the Australian Home Insulation Scheme debacle that the minister asked for the existence of a risk assessment so that he would feel more confident about a decision that everyone knew was bad. And he didn't ask about the content. He didn't ask like, what are the risks or what should we do? He wanted to know about the existence of the risk assessment. And that's what they're for. Is they're things that make us feel good about decisions, not things that make us have decisions that are good that we can feel good about.
So even if there was research on looking at the quality of the decisions or the types of decisions, you would probably expect there to be a correlation anyway. It just the risk assessment just happens to be there when decisions were good. Do you think? Like you'd naturally probably find that link anyway?
Yeah, I still go back to you'd expect the risk assessment to happen before the decision was made. Right? Without that, doesn't really matter if decisions are good or bad. The risk assessment couldn't possibly have influenced it.
It just happens to be along for the ride, yeah. What questions should an effective risk assessment ask? And I actually just plugged your disaster cast on another show I was talking on. You spoke about the Lord of the Rings example. So what would a good risk example look like to you, and what would it do?
So this gets back to what are safety activities for in the first place. The sociologist in me wants to say the purpose of risk assessments is to make us feel that our decisions are more mechanical and better than they actually are. So current risk assessments are perfect. They've evolved to do exactly what they're supposed to do. But what they're supposed to do isn't actually. So let's turn that around, because the common assumption is that we're actually trying to reduce the severity and likelihood of hazards. In which case, a good risk assessment would ask that exact question. What should we do next to reduce either the severity or the likelihood of things going wrong? And if it can help you answer that question in a way that causes you to take an action that does actually reduce the severity, or the risk assessment has helped you. But funnily enough, we do all of these other things in risk assessments. We very seldom just make the assumption that we're going to take an action and make the risk assessment about deciding what that action should be.
Does that happen in any other fields that you know of? Like in engineering, do they typically do that, or is this quite a rare practice?
Oh, it's very common. The easiest way to see this is if you look at engineering students doing assignments, that they will do the assignment first and then they will write the design document explaining how they designed it. You ask them to write a piece of code, they'll write the code and then they will write the flowchart of how the code works. So it's not that unusual in life to do things first, document them later, as a way of communicating or showing to other people. But if we believe that, process helps, then you've got to actually do the process in the order that it's supposed to happen. There are lots of things in life where we make them seem more deterministic or more rational than they actually are through this retrospective use of formal process.